Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nikki Dumbrell. And she comes from Australia. And her main research interests are exploring the questions around how we use and manage natural resources to achieve environmental and social sustainability in a time of significant environmental change, which is a very relevant and impactful question. And some of the two main facets, I guess, of how Dr. Dumbrell has gone about approaching this question is understanding how natural resource use and the impacts of those use are understood by all stakeholders who are involved in their use, and then understanding the effectiveness of different information, policies, incentives, or disincentives to encourage alternate resource use and decision processes. Dr. Dumbrell has a Bachelor's of Science with honors in Environment and Natural Resources from the University of Western Australia. Then in 2022, she earned a PhD in Applied Economics from the University of Adelaide, which is also. And her current position is a postdoctoral fellow with CSIRO and a particular program called Valuing Sustainability Future Science Platform. CSIRO stands for the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, which is a government agency in Australia which specializes in applying scientific research to solving challenges within commercial settings and contexts. And they particularly go about this work through engaging with stakeholders involved with land use and sustainability, investments, policies, and markets, and with kind of the overarching goal of expanding environmental decision-making beyond cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis, which is very common amongst economics. And Dr. Dumbrell's main project, which I believe stems from her dissertation work, is entitled Valuing Local Provenance and Place-Based Economies and Natural Capital and Low Carbon Markets and Industries. And this helps develop and integrate benefits that into emerging sustainability markets that are specifically locally defined and accepted. And overall, this promotes land-based solutions to sustainability and ENR problems that incorporate local culture, indigenous beliefs, and place. Other projects she's had her hand in include carbon farming adaptation to achieve greenhouse gas mitigation, as well as a social license to operate, and particularly focusing on how markets and government initiatives have maybe failed in the past and learning for those in order to better influence and stakeholders to implement environmental projects. And then sustainably supporting vegetable industries in Southeast Asia, particularly helping those industries become more sustainable and profitable. We're excited to have Dr. Dumbrell join us today for her international perspective on environmental issues that are very common and prevalent here in Wyoming, particularly on a rural focus. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nikki.
Thanks, Dave. G'day, everyone. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the stuff we're doing in Australia. As is outlined, I have a background in economics. I also grew up on a relatively small beef and dairy property on the south coast of Western Australia. I live in Canberra now, which is like your DC, not the big city, but just the city where the government is. And I'm really excited today to share a lot of what's happening in Australia. So we do read the international literature, don't panic. We do know, but today is really about what we've got going on in our own backyard to share that with you all. And the presentation is today across quite a few things. It's not very economicsy, it's very interdisciplinary. It comes from a project I work on with a bunch of different disciplines, and the core idea has been about not the individual landholder where an activity might happen, not the overall efficacy or impact of a policy, but the kind of that regional scope of that in-between scale of what's happening outside the farm gate. So we don't call them ranches, they're just all farms. You grow whatever you like, you're a farm. So that's the language I'm going to use today. And we're not discriminating, you grow whatever you like. Sometimes graziers will be graziers who have cows on big different things. And the rangelands are kind of like the desert for us, right? So it's folks with reasonable sized properties that you might call rangelands. They're still just a farm in Australia. Okay, so challenge, first one, it worked before. All right, why am I here? I'm part of this Valuing Sustainability Future Science platform that Sam mentioned, which was a $12 million investment from our organisation in Australia. So they have money from the government. We also work on externally funded grants. And from time to time, we sit there and think, not we, I'm not in those rooms, the boffins sit there and think, what should we be investing in for our future? Where should we be thinking about kind of blue sky, sort of Horizon 3 research that we need to be building capability in, so that in 5 years' time or whatever it might be, we have that capability ready to go for those research projects. So one of the things they decided to do was invest all this money in 15 versions of me, postdocs, but they all have different disciplinary backgrounds, ecologists, or you name it, they're not all economists. And they have 7 different projects sitting under this umbrella. And broadly, we all care about building capability and evidence for co-designed transdisciplinary science. So we have these different investments for all sorts of tech and funky other areas of science. And our one has been really about this idea of co-designed transdisciplinary science, something we have in common. And thematically, the projects we all work on are providing confidence, hopefully, that actions across places and supply chains lead to positive outcomes for land, water, biodiversity, and people, right? So we're really care about and love everyone and everything kind of approach. And as was mentioned earlier as well, I worked specifically on one project of those 7, which has got this really long title that none of us ever say, and we've just shortened it to call it the Local Provenance Project. So I might use that shorthand. The QR code there takes you to that website, but you can also use the great thing of Google. It says CSIRO Local Provenance, and we'll pop up. On that project, I work with geographers, STS scholars, which are science and technology studies, which is really a hardcore social science, other economists and ecologists, and a whole mixed bag of folks. And what have we been concerned about? We recognise that we have this pretty big challenge with a joint climate and biodiversity crisis. Australia is doing really well at sending mammal species extinct. I think we're leading the world. And in response to, in particular, this carbon problem that we have been turning very regularly to the land sector to help us out with that. So this graph here is out from a report that was released last week from the Climate Change Authority, which is an independent government institution that is set up to advise the government on climate policy things. They used and worked with a whole bunch of our colleagues at CSIRO to do this, and the grey colour is where are we at in 2022. And if we want to meet our goals by 2050, it's where we need to be is in the red. So we continue to really care about planting trees to help us in the land sector. And we continue, we're going to need to do some work in our agriculture sector. So what separates our land and agriculture sector in this sense? Land sector means a lot of forestry, avoided deforestation and planting of trees. Agriculture picks up the soil carbon component, as well as reducing emissions from cows, piggeries, you name it. So we have quite a reliance on that sector. We also recognise that if we want to make change in those areas, we're not going to do that by looking after our national parks just a little bit better, right? We're going to have to work with agricultural land and Indigenous land. That's the place where we have room to make gains. So if we look at a map of Indigenous land tenure in Australia and agricultural land in Australia, so we'll start with the Indigenous one. It's a slightly outdated map. And it looks like they own and manage a lot of Australia in all the different types of yellow and red. And orangey colour. They don't actually have access or exclusive rights over that land, so it looks like they're using a lot there. So I would actually focus a lot more on this sort of maroon colour, and this orange colour is more of the property that they are owning and managing, or at least co-managing. So in other words, the desert and really remote Australia. And then if we look over here on the other side, that is agricultural land use. The dark outline is a kind of wheat and sheep zone, which is where we do most of our production of agricultural outputs. And this grey colour is grazing of native vegetation. And the white colour is the desert, where even we know we can't make things grow very well. So that is a lot of Australia's land, right? And if we want to be making gains, that's probably the areas we need to be looking at. And these are the communities we probably need to be talking with. So have I managed to, oops, go too far forward. So if we're thinking about, we have those patches of land, we want to do something a bit different on those properties to move from being all about agricultural production to doing something pro-environmental, right? This is a schematic from a professor at the University of Western Australia where I learned and trained. His name is Dave Pannell. He's kind of roughly tried to say on one axis we have public benefit, vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis we have private benefit. That says what kind of incentive or policy tools do we have to operate in these different spaces. So if you want to implement a change that you think might land us, roughly in this quadrant up the top right, where this change is going to create public net benefits and private net benefits, don't pay them to do it. Like they probably should be doing it anyway, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe they just need some extension or some information or some looking over the neighbour's fence to see that this works. If the thing you think you want to change falls over the other side into that negative private net benefit area, maybe we need new technologies. Maybe we need to work on new ways of doing things, or maybe we need some positive incentives and pay people to do this work, right? So that might be grants, that might be market systems or whatever it might be. And hopefully, of course, if something's negative for public and private outcomes, you also don't need to do anything, right? Hopefully. So that's a very kind of rough way of looking at things. And what we see when we're investing as a government organisation or as a private organisation, we have a big focus as an economist by training on efficiency and efficacy. For every dollar spent, what did I get for it? And did the way I spent that dollar or the way I use that policy tool or regulation, a market-based instrument, whatever, is that the most efficient way to achieve the outcome I want, right? Or is it the most expensive way to achieve the outcome I want? That's what they tend to care about. And then we also ask a lot of questions about why would someone want to participate or adopt this practice, even though we might be paying them, even though, it might be really clear to us that the benefits are there. There's a lot of things to consider about why you would want to sign up and participate. And that thing is like attributes of the landholder, what motivates them, what do they care about, what stage of their career are they in, how much money have they got, you name it. And we also care about the attributes of the program or the land management change to be made, right? So what does participation look like? Does it look like heaps of paperwork to do? That's off-putting. We think also that paddock, I don't know if what you guys don't have paddocks, just have patches of land, pastures, right? Pasture or ranch scale kind of benefits and community scale co-benefits, so what's happening outside your fence, and opportunity costs, so what you have to give up to get that thing, they matter, right? They influence your adoption decisions. It's not all just about money, right? If you want to walk downtown with your head held high, you don't really want to be doing something that your neighbour hates, right? Or something like that. Those social influences have a role to play. So all those things influence your participation or your action in these environmental markets. Right, so we've done a lot of work on what's happening at that individual landholder scale or ranch scale. And what our projects started to think about is like, what's happening at that kind of community scale? So we've been asking questions about aligning decarbonisation and community goals. And what we think, we see evidence for it as well, is investments tend to be focused on environmental outcomes, right? Water, salinity, carbon, biodiversity, erosion, you name it. That's the big issue that unlocks the money to come from the federal government or wherever it will be water quality in the Great Barrier Reef. That's what the money's for example. And then now we started asking questions about the co-benefits from that thing, right? And we've also started thinking about this idea of provenance. Who, where, and how that carbon abatement project was done matters, we think. Whether anyone wants to pay for that is a bit. That's a couple of things that have been driving our thinking, and conceptually, we think there's quite an overlap between this idea of co-benefits and provenance. The co-benefits often depend on place-specific conditions, right? For you to be able to generate that co-benefit, you might need to be in the right place of the countryside. You might need to have the right people around you. You might need to be in the right community to be able to produce that co-benefit. And they can also be quite place-specific in their benefits that they produce. They can also be very kind of spread out and everywhere. Provenance provenance is basically the who, what, and where something was produced, has a lot of importance placed on place-specific social outcomes, right? So the reason why you would care about provenance of your wine in France and you want to protect the name and the label of that thing, is for economic opportunities for your town, right? So that someone else over there in Australia can't also make champagne, right? And they have to call it sparkling wine instead. So and we think those things, there might be a relationship happening there between those two things. We also know the big challenge is that the more sensitive a measure of something, or the more specific something is to a community to tell you all these lovely things about these co-benefits and how much we care about provenance and how much we write a big narrative and take beautiful photos of people, the more localized we make that, the harder it is to scale that to a market or scale that to a policy program where the people sitting in those rooms care about comparing across different investments or comparing across different supply chains and where they want to put their money, whatever. They like numbers in a spreadsheet. Have words and photos and lovely, right? So those things, it's really hard to make those things talk to each other, and it's really hard to get scale, right? So I think you guys are a bit the same. We have beautiful scientific results on this little patch here, right? Now we've got all these other acres. We want to do this one. Oh, hard. So that's same thing happens in Australia. So what I'm going to talk about today is a case study we've done with land sector carbon abatement projects in Queensland. Queensland is the triangle-y shaped state up here. So we have tropical to sort of subtropical environments. I live down here in this little bubble here, and I grew up over in this little town over here. Can you start? Oh, yeah, you can see my mouse. Okay, I grew up down there. Anyway, and this photo I have here is approximately taken from this little white dot in the middle of a carbon abatement project. So these folks are doing a carbon abatement project that tells them they're not going to clear their trees, right? So you can see in this picture, we have some mature-ish looking trees for Australian standards. And then we have some small little sapling types, right? And this part of Queensland, it's really low. And then you take out this little chapel. And so these guys are regularly in a pattern of land clearing, right, to enable grazing of those properties. What we're doing is saying, like, well, can you keep more of them and let them get up to what we kind of classify as a forest for these purposes is 20% canopy cover. So that's the aim these guys are trying to get to with this property. The project is not across their entire property, it's just a patch of their property that they're doing this in. And I think they have approximately 20,000 acres, these folks. And that's big, right? But not like huge for Australian standards. Right. And this reason why we're focused on Queensland will hopefully soon become clear to you. But before we do that, I'll just give you a quick, brief history lesson of Australia's carbon market. So federally, we have a carbon market that is entirely voluntary. And in 2011, we set up this policy scheme called the Carbon Farming Initiative. It's for the land sector only. So piggeries to capture gas from their piggery and use it for electricity or something like that. Landfill gas, a few other, we had only a short list of things you could do, right? Savanna burning projects, etc. And it was entirely voluntary to adopt one of those things and get involved. 2012, we set up a carbon pricing mechanism, affectionately or not affectionately referred to as Australia's carbon tax. And that, under that regulation, meant the 500 biggest polluters of carbon in Australia had to reduce their emissions or pay 23 Australian dollars per tonne to continue to be allowed to pollute, right? And if a company couldn't reduce their emissions for that price, they could go and offset it, right? So if you're a landholder that's doing a carbon project, you could expect you could earn somewhere close to this $23 a tonne. Someone would pay you marginally less than that to be able to offset. 2013 came along and we got rid of our carbon tax, right? Which meant we got rid of demand for these carbon credits that these landholders could be producing. So that came into effect in 2014. 2015, we just renamed it, right? I'm telling you the names of all these policies. You don't need to care, but just in case you ever want to Google it and find out that a paper written in 2015 is talking about the same sort of policy or not. We renamed it the Emissions Reduction Fund. We put a bunch of government money into a fund to pay people to enter these reverse auctions and get contracted to supply abatement to the Australian government, right? So a reverse auction means you write on a piece of paper, a lot of pieces of paper, approximately how many tonnes, for what cost, doing it what way, that you can offer the government, right? And the government will look at all those offers they've got and choose the ones they want to buy. And they want to buy the least cost ones, right? The cheapest ones. And it became economy-wide. So it's not just the land sector anymore. So people are replacing their light bulbs with more efficient light bulbs as well, for example. 2017, our Land Restoration Fund was announced. So that's an example from the photo previously is the program they're involved in and the focus of the rest of the talk today. And the government also offered optional contracts, right? So you can come into a contract with us out of this reverse auction scheme. And if, when it comes time, you can still choose to sell to us at that price, or if there's a higher price on offer somewhere else, you can go and sell it there, right? So you have the option to sell it to the government at that probably lower price, or you can have the option to go and sell it to someone else, right? So they essentially set a floor price for carbon. 2022, we've now made it possible for anyone that signed a government contract to deliver to the government to exit those contracts and sell on a secondary market if you want to. I think the government doesn't want to have to keep paying for all this stuff, right? And we also had a big review into the emissions reduction fund with a focus on integrity, right? How true is it that when you're all telling us how much carbon you've abated, that we've actually abated that much carbon? 2023, we renamed it again. Now we call it the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme. And we now have a policy called the safeguard mechanism, which we expect should create some compliance demand. So that's the thing that says, all right, you're emitting this much at the moment, big polluters, we're going to gradually ratchet that down. Right? And if you can't ratchet that down at a reasonable price, you can go and offset your carbon in this market. Okay, prices. We care about prices. So this is a strange, perhaps, snapshot in time across the vertical axis that I've decided to pull out here. This is a graph of the spot market for an Australian carbon credit unit, ACU. Right, so this is if you just turn up that day and you decide to sell, this is what you might be able to get. And back in May 2020 and earlier, it was always less than $20 a tonne. And that's what the government's offering too, right? So we can only see the government reverse auction average prices, and they've gone from about $10 a tonne Australian to about $17 a tonne Australian. Not much, right? And then we started to grow our price. Awesome, cool. And then what on earth happened here? It was an announcement that abatement contracted to the government could be released from those contracts, right? And the reason I show you this snippet, I suppose, is to say that it's quite a thin market, right? An announcement like that had this level of impact on the price, that means we don't have lots of suppliers and demanders, lots of transactions going on, right? So in economic theory, a market is an efficient way to do things when you have lots of buyers and sellers, right? And we don't have that yet in this market. Our supply is currently outstripping our demand. We expect that to change when we get to 2030 targets and 2050 targets, when everyone's gone, oh no, quick, I'll just go and buy some offsets, right? And the price of those things might go up. And now, like from this point in October 2022, the price has kind of trickled along at a pretty similar point. Fun fact, if anyone really cares, we introduced a shadow price of $70 for Australian energy market forecasting. Shadow price basically means not a real price, but a price of kind of what we think it's going to cost us socially to be polluting this much carbon. So building in our modelling for our future energy market decisions, we're kind of using that number. And our carbon price is nowhere near that, which I find interesting. You might be like, cool. So what have we got? 2024, this is the map of carbon projects in Australia. This is not our map. This is a map made from some folks at the Australian National University across the road from us. And what you notice first is these zones up the top, these colours, right? So we have the desert in the middle, and we have these rangelandy areas, which I basically call the desert too, but that's fine. It's horses for courses. In these bits, this agricultural zone in these green areas, and the savanna up the top. Then on top, we have all these different coloured symbols for different types of methodologies to abate carbon. And the one you notice up the top here, we have lots of savanna burning projects. So that's a lot of folks using cool burning techniques, particularly Indigenous methods, to burn early in the season rather than letting fuel loads really grow and then massive out of control fires. Then we have these purpley ones everywhere, and that's called human-induced regeneration, which basically just means take your cows away or take your activities away and let things regrow. And you'll notice they're all over the place. And we have some avoided deforestation projects, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, you can look this up in a paper in the Rangeland Journal. It's an Australian journal. If you're really keen to have a look at this, should be on their front page because it's really freshly released. Right. So this land restoration fund that we've been talking about. What the Land Restoration Fund is a policy that sits on top of this Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme, production fund that used to be called the Carbon Farming Initiative, that sits only in the Queensland, state of Queensland. And what they have is 500 million Australian dollars, 350 million US, to invest to enable and financially reward landholders to provide land sector carbon abatement and priority environment, socioeconomic and First Nations benefits. Right, so they're kind of paying you extra to do your projects in a different way, or doing your projects in a different area, doing your projects in a way that you can account for these additional benefits above and beyond carbon. So these are their kind of 3 key priority areas. We formed a partnership with these folks because jointly, we both really care about this third part. We also think this third part's really hard, right? Not that the other bits are really easy, but this third part of how do you account for social and economic sustainability? How do you measure that you've achieved something? How do you reward that sort of thing? So that's what we've been working on with them for a few years now. And Drew, why am I here? Drew has been sitting on a science reference group for this project that we have, and we've been working in partnership with this government. So Drew has to join some 2 a.m. phone calls for Australian times schedules, like a couple of times a year, and say, oh yeah, I think they're doing something sensible. That makes some sense. Like, there are people out in the world that also care about those things. So lucky Drew. So what have we been thinking about? We've been thinking about this idea of how do we value social co-benefits? How do we measure them? How do we show evidence that they exist so that then they have value? And so working with the Land Restoration Fund, in their documentation, they say they really care about First Nations participation, whether the projects are happening on First Nations land, whether the projects can support skills training and jobs in regional areas. So not jobs for auditors or reporters or tech gurus in an office in the big cities, and create economic activity in disadvantaged regions. Meaning when you get all your carbon money, you spend it at local stores on local people and that sort of thing. And in doing all of this, the Land Restoration Fund has a few challenges, right? Participation. Every environmental payment program cares about participation, right? Why would people want to sign up to voluntarily do this thing with you? How do we design programs that make it easy to participate? So they care about that. But they also have a bit of trouble tailoring messages about the opportunities for this for really different parts of Queensland, right? Like up on the Cape, super remote, lots of Indigenous communities. They don't care about the same things that Noosa on the Sunshine Coast with the hippies and the beach, lots of people. They don't care about the same things, right? And so they don't currently have like different messages to sort of think about what that means for these different communities. They also have questions about what's the best, or how can we incorporate more social information to use in our investment decisions. At the moment, they've got a map of Queensland, area of Queensland, climate type, soil type, vegetation type, threatened species habitat, blah, 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 blah. And they can go, okay, we've got some modelling. We expect over 20 years to grow this much carbon. They don't have the same kind of map of people-y things. We thought, well, we do something like that. And then the third bit is this evaluation. How do you measure the social co-benefits you've achieved? So what we did is we got in the room together and we worked in partnership with this slogan of sharing knowledge to share responsibility. So we didn't come up with that. I think it's like an STS scholar from Harvard, Sheila Jasanoff or someone like that writes about that stuff. But it's kind of helped us to think about, we jumped in the room with these people. We didn't sit outside and observe and measure independently like you might think traditionally scientists do. We're like, nah, gonna get in the room, right? And what we did was have this focus on this co-design process. And the two things, so these are the outer rings of this circle. What we cared about there was this idea of what is the context and the sustainability goals of the Queensland Government department we're working with in this program, but also what's happening in the real world, right? Like what are the things they have to be aware about and control and adapt for and cover and all those sorts of things. And the inner circle is this idea of these really intangible concepts of team science and innovation. How do you work in partnership with people and build trust and work as a team that forever has different careers of people that want to go and do other things or get pulled their attention another way? And how do you hold that team together and hold those people together to keep working on a challenge like this. And then looking back, we probably had 3 phases of work that we did. So we established some foundations. What are your challenges? What are your pain points? What are our skills? What can we do? What are the parts of your policy program that are just set in stone and you cannot change? What are the areas where we might be able to play with something and tweak something and have a bit of a play? What are the rules of the policy? What does the literature say? Blah, 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 blah. And then we kind of got all that together and thought, right, now we know all that stuff. What are we actually going to do together? So then we did some doing of some stuff, and we built a dashboard to help us have these conversations about what might matter. I'll come to that. And then we kind of got to this stage of like, right, what do we settle on? What if we open the door now to your policy friends in the Great Barrier Reef or wetlands or disaster management, whatever? What do they make of this thing? Could we scale this beyond this case study or this little partnership of ourselves? So this is our dashboard. So we built a dashboard, and typically, me included, everyone wants to go, what's the answer? It's 7 or it's 8 or whatever. And unfortunately, in a challenge like this, there's no one answer or one number or one thing, right? So what we did is put a whole bunch of data together and have conversations about it. So the dashboard doesn't have the answer. The dashboard just has a bunch of data and different visualizations to help support those conversations. It was never really a tool to give to the Queensland government and go, see ya, good luck. We always came with the tool to the room for conversations, right? And so what we did in this dashboard was stack a whole bunch of information. So we have quantitative and qualitative information about social and economic context, right? Demographics, businesses, official statistics that you guys probably have equivalents of, and regional planning documents about what do these communities want. And we sat on top of that, where have they currently invested? And what are the co-benefits these current projects are trying to achieve? And can we see patterns in that? And then just because it might be relevant later, some specific Australianness, the regions we used represent communities that are socially and economically interacting with each other, which just means like the people down the road, right? And each region is a different size, but has roughly 10,000 people in it. So you see out here, this area is like so big. And then there's tiny little tiny ones in the city. One of the things we think is cool about this dashboard is we developed some knowledge maps like this one. I'm going around and spending a lot of my 2023 reading. AI was a bit too late for me for this purpose, okay? Reading local government plans, natural resource management plans, economic development plans for all these different communities and regions of Queensland, right? So it's a legislative requirement that every local government in Queensland has to write one of these plans, right? So it's a data source. It's going to be available for the government should they wish to kind of take this up in the future, right? Rather than us doing a survey and then that data being out of date, rather than us or the Queensland government driving around Queensland for an entire year to see everyone and going into some really hot town halls of angst and trouble, it's like this could be an alternative, maybe, data approach. So what we did is read them for all these things that the Land Restoration Fund cares about, but also the literature tends to care about. So here, it's just a little example. We have what are the sorts of things that are driving transitions in these southern Queensland landscapes communities. Local governments are talking about some things, Indigenous organisations are talking about some things, NRM are talking about some things, and the size of these circles is the relative frequency that these types of topics are talked about. And then you could click on each button and it comes up with a little summary of what we reckon these folks are talking about. So that's one element of our dashboard. And this is publicly available on our project website. You can click through to find. I think we have data on there for 4 natural resource management regions of Queensland, but not all of Queensland. Another way of cutting that data, it's exactly the same data, is looking at what are the benefit aspirations of these different groups? What are the drivers of change that these different groups are writing about? And how do they potentially align with the potential co-benefits of carbon investments, right? So we looked at First Nations plans, NRM plans, local government plans, and they care about different things, right? So it really does matter when you go to those communities who you call up and talk to, or who you invite, or who you can manage to get into the room when you're putting on a focus group or whatever it means. And who should you call up in those communities? And you'll get a very different answer, right? So we found it quite interesting that, of course, these different groups have different mandates or jobs or responsibilities in the community, right? Local governments care a lot about jobs and facilities and social capital might mean social cohesion and footpaths and things that enable people to get out and about. And of course, unsurprisingly, First Nations plans are like, what are the benefits for us? What's in it for us? Like jobs, what are we looking for? These are the things like we want to have kind of determination over our future. Drivers of change, we also see some kind of different patterns here. And we have different things driving those changes. This is a paper that we have published. You can Google that too. My name, the Rangeland Journal, social things, and that should pop up too. And you can have a look at this graph in a bit more detail if you like to. But then what did we do after thinking about all this sort of stuff, having a play, remembering that we too often tend to care about these environmental benefits, not so much about these social? Photo. So the photo here is from a catchment out to the Great Barrier Reef in the ocean here. And if we have overgrazing in our catchments, we have sediment out in the reef, right? So that blocks the sunlight and the photosynthesis of the beautiful coral. So we also have a problem with nitrogen and other things. So there's a lot of money flocking to those things, right? And instead of just focusing on the sediment, we wonder, you know, what are these communities doing? What is important to them, et cetera, et cetera. So we think a small step change that the Land Restoration Fund might be able to make in their decision making is to think about these 5 things. These are things that we have data on, that we think that data will always exist and be available and accessible to the Queensland government and always be somewhat up to date. And these are things that I think, you know, match their challenges or interests that they had. So what do you mean, this aspirations idea? It's like, what are these communities writing about in their plans? How do they align with the investments the Queensland government want to make? Relative socioeconomic disadvantage. The Australian Bureau of Statistics come up with some stats to help you with that. That's published every 5 years. Remoteness, Australian Bureau of Statistics also does that for you. So that'll come out every 5 years. Economic specialisation, how many people in this region have a job in this sector of the economy that should we start doing heaps more carbon farming? Like their skills are going to be in demand, or should we decide to move away from that area of doing things? The jobs are at risk, right? And they're not going to be terribly happy about those things. And do they have knowledge brokers? And I've been in Laramie for 3 days, and there are so many trusts, so many departments, so many people you have to talk to do a project or get an investment or whatever. I have a list of acronyms, right? And it might not be that complicated. It's just that I don't understand it yet. But we tend to have a few, 2 or 3 pathways, right? To send money from federal government policy or state government policy says, we don't want too much sediment in the reef, down to a natural resource management region, 56 of those across Australia, and their responsibility is to sort of enact those things locally. That's our knowledge broker, right? Or an extension officer who might be in the Department of Agriculture and help you with your beef production things, or that's the type of people we're talking about as our knowledge brokers. So what do we learn when we start looking and thinking about those 5 characteristics? And we use those 5 characteristics to look at the distribution of investments in carbon abatement so far. Carbon abatement projects are in socioeconomically disadvantaged regions of Australia. But you could probably logically kind of sit and think, oh yeah, that makes sense. But now we have some evidence, right? So the graph here tells us deciles of socioeconomic disadvantage. Our most disadvantaged communities are on the left, D1, and our least disadvantaged communities. Our blue bars tell us how much land are in those regions. Disadvantaged folks have heaps of land and don't, because they live in suburban Brisbane or in high-rise apartments or whatever. It's concreted and there's no room to do a carbon project there, right? It kind of makes sense that the folks with land are doing carbon projects. This is not groundbreaking stuff, right? But we do notice that we are putting these projects in these communities. And that should be something that we keep in the back of our mind when we think about this stuff. We keep asking these people to take on these projects. More and more and more and more of them. Are we going to get to a tipping point that this is going to become really important? Maybe. Least cost carbon abatement projects tend to be in more remote locations, right? So when I talk about that, I mean these ACCU scheme projects, and you go to the government in your reverse auction scheme, and they're going to buy it, and all you're delivering is carbon, not carbon plus these other things that the Land Restoration Fund cares about. They tend to be the purple squares from the map earlier, right? In the middle of the desert, nowhere. And you might not grow like much carbon. If you do a big area, you can grow some carbon. So that's something that we think is quite interesting. We also tend to notice that our land restoration fund projects tend to be in these communities where what the land restoration fund is interested in doing is also what we're reading about in the community plans from these regions. There's alignment between those aspirations. Perhaps by accident so far, perhaps not, we can't really say. We also have some insights about how we did this research, right? So we tend to focus on what we did research on: environment, natural resources, people, communities. How did we do this research in partnership with a government department and pull some stuff off, right? And we think engagement in an iterative, open-ended, co-design space was really important. We did not walk into the room with the Queensland government and say, got the solution, do you want it? Or we think you want it, here you go, because that's a ticket to them shelving it and letting it collect dust and never get used. So if we invite them to co-design this and have ideas and recognize that they have knowledge, right? Researchers are not the only people that have knowledge. They really are more likely to be in a position to create something usable and credible for them. And also this idea of scoping and testing the value of ideas with our dashboard. Here's first iteration, go away, make something else, bring it back. And sharing knowledge to share responsibility can really support this idea of science policy innovation for impact. We think we've had a tiny impact. Like the boat stuck in the Suez Canal, kind of like gone a little bit, right? We're not claiming too much, but and that's a big win. Like I'm super proud of that. It's enough for me, right? It's enough for me to keep coming back. So a key message, and a key message of all the conversations I had when I walked down the economics corridors of your campus on Monday, everyone wants to talk about additionality, right? And that means, would this stuff have happened without this policy, right? Not before and after the policy, but with and without the policy. And would these community social impacts, changes, jobs on offer have changed? That's really hard to measure, right? So it remains a challenge, and we're not claiming we've solved that challenge. But we also, key message of this how inside, I suppose, is this idea that collaborative mechanisms are quite critical, right? Rather than us saying, right, we have the knowledge, we're the best, we've got some stuff, we're the researchers, this is what you pay us for. That doesn't have enough credibility or legitimacy for the users of this stuff, right? And a really economicsy point to finish on, I can't help it, is that there are trade-offs between optimizing for international environmental or national environmental outcomes, like net zero carbon. You can go and buy all your least cost carbon, fine. But if you also want to be delivering locally valued outcomes and trying to do it in a way that we don't leave communities behind, or we don't have social tension over how we achieve net zero, I think, okay, maybe that then has efficiency and efficacy implications for our discipline who care about that. But does it really, right? Like if we focus entirely on optimizing our carbon, are we actually going to cost ourselves something by not caring about that human factor in how that happens? Final slide is just some stuff we've got on the go, some stuff I'm going to be spending my time doing, some stuff we might rope Drew into doing when he comes and visits us in Australia. This poor guy is the guy that has all the photos on the CSIRO website of being the farmer, right, of what it looks like, that we all have rights to use. What we care about is this idea of quality jobs, right? So social sustainability can sometimes be a bit arm-wavy. What do you mean? It's fluffy, give me something to hang on to as an investor, but also as a community group or organisation or landholder. So we think this idea of quality jobs is a key social sustainability topic, right? So these jobs are understood by local communities. They value jobs. So do investors and government departments and all those folks. And one of the questions and one of the things we're doing some writing about at the moment is how do carbon projects or other conservation natural capital projects change the nature of work on a farm? You might have got into farming because you like outdoors and blue skies, and until it hasn't rained, then you want grey skies, autonomy, all that kind of stuff, right? And now increasingly those folks are sitting at a desk and they're paying someone else to ride the horse, to look after the cows, to do that kind of stuff, right? Does that matter? Is that important? What does that mean? And are we missing something important in our current reporting framework, right? So it's given some money, and in return, we want to know how many jobs you supported. It doesn't tell us anything about quality or the type of job, or whether they're ecology jobs instead of horse riding jobs or that kind of thing. We're not sure, right? It could be important, it could be, we don't care. And the other one is this idea of testing a quality job indicator for sustainability, investment, communication, and risk minimisation. So we still care about meeting the minimum compliance with regulations of how you would treat your employees. You go above that, great, fine. But we're not really rewarding that behaviour. And is there room to be doing that? Do we want to be doing that? Should we be doing that? It's something we're thinking about. So I'll leave it there. And open for questions. Yeah. Have I left not enough time? Okay, cool. And I'll hang around if anyone else doesn't have anywhere to run to. Yeah. Drew's breaking the ice.
Really curious about these co-benefits. Looking at these different co-benefits, they're trying to weigh different projects from one to the next, right? And so is the idea like how many check marks you get like for different social benefits, and how do you weigh that against the check marks you're getting for, say, like reef benefits and that sort of thing, or like how does, like in the decision-making context, I guess, like how do you think about these like social indicators? Like where does that hit the road with how Queensland government's actually going to make decisions? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the information we have access to from the Queensland government tells us on average how much they've paid additional to these projects that have these different sets of co-benefits they expect to deliver. Right, so on average, they've paid, you know, however many dollars more than the kind of base carbon price. And then if we map that against these different profiles of co-benefits that they expect to deliver, we don't see that much of a pattern. When you map it against the methodology that is being used to store the carbon, avoided clearing, planting trees, those sorts of things, then we see the pattern, right? Avoided clearing is really easy to do. You don't need to go and clear some trees. Probably need less people to do that, right? If you have to plant some trees, that's hard work and it's expensive work. And they want to recognise that and say, we're going to pay you more for doing that. So that's where we tend to see, we do tend to see a different kind of expected co-benefit distribution in different regions of Queensland. So do tend to see, it's kind of obviously, if you're familiar with the demographics and the distribution of communities, in North Queensland and the Savannah burning projects, there's a lot of Indigenous communities up there, right? And it's kind of like, if you don't include or work with Indigenous people up there, it's like, why not? You know, like everyone else can do it. Why can't you, right? So they tend to be scoring quite high up on those, being able to be in a disadvantaged region, be in a remote location, include Indigenous people. So they tend to be sitting up in that kind of area. But with the biggest kind of correlation, I suppose, is with the methodology used, not the social co-benefit. So it's hard to say this many hectares of koala habitat is worth this many jobs. But then we can't see obvious trade-offs between those things. And they don't dictate how or publish how they're going to do that, because they've sort of set out an idea that they want to invest in a kind of diverse set of projects, diverse in location, diverse in the methodologies they use, diverse in the people doing them and the places they're in. They want to think about risk, they want to think about price and those sorts of things, right? So they might be willing, even if a project doesn't have very many social co-benefits lined up, but if it's in a region that they don't have any other projects doing, in an ecosystem that they don't have many other projects doing, they might really want to pay for that. So they kind of leave it open for themselves to be able to build a diverse portfolio. I think over time that'll become more clear. First round of investments are like, oh, we'll fund the best projects perhaps. And over time they might start making those decisions about, they care about this diversity of their portfolio. They care about, you know, the distribution of where the job opportunities are that they've been investing in. Don't know.
I hate to say it, but we're at about time.
Sure.
And many of us are in another class right afterwards, but we've got 10 minutes till that class starts. So if folks have questions, please visit and hang out and stuff. And let's thank Nikki one more time. And thank you online people for being here. Next week, join us again.